Curtis Schaafsma. I was a geology major at the University of Colorado and needed a job in the summer of 1959. I consulted with somebody at Mesa Verde National Park about a job, and I ended up working on the Weathero Mesa Archaeological Survey with Al Hayes in the summer of 1959. And in the course of working with Al, I recognized that he had the same kind of respect for data as I was used to expecting from people doing geology. And again, I was still a geology major. Now, the next summer, 1960, I was employed as an assistant archaeologist on the Navajo Reservoir project. Still, I was a geology major. On the other hand, I was taught by a quite competent archaeologist how to do proper field archaeology. And even then, the next summer, 1961, I was back at the Navajo Reservoir project, and I realized that it was a proper kind of empirical scientific enterprise. And that year, I changed my major at the University of Colorado from geology to anthropology. And believe it or not, my main incentive was to not have to go to work for oil companies, which is kind of what I was condemned to do if I was to continue being a geology person. I said, I don't want to work with those people. And I went to be an anthropologist to avoid being a rat fake working for the geology oil companies. So it was a negative push. But I also realized that people doing field archaeology, like I had been doing, were proper empirical scientists. I could work with those people. So I continued doing that as a job. For Navajo Reservoir, I did that for 4 field seasons, eventually being field director of the Navajo Survey, the archaeological project, where we were digging pit houses with backhoes and dump trucks and toothpicks, dental equipment. In other words, we were good archaeologists, good field archaeologists. And so I wandered into doing archaeology because I had a good, strong feeling from my geology background of what empirical research should be done. And I could realize we could continue doing that as an archaeologist. So really I did that because it was good, basic, decent research. So I really wasn't drawn into archaeology. I was sort of pushed into archaeology. Certainly up until the time I went back to graduate school, spent most of my time being first a field archaeologist, and then secondly I did a lot of lab analysis, especially for Bertha Dutton starting in 1965. I did a lot of ceramic analysis. And then eventually, 1974, I started a contract program at the School of American Research and did a lot of work at Abiquiu Reservoir using rather detailed analyses of lithics. So I was doing ceramic analysis first, but then I also did a lot of work with stone tool lithics. So it was a combination of continuing to do field archaeology during the contract program at SAR, as School of American Research, and a lot of super detailed work with computers and stuff. And ultimately, that background served me because when they hired me to be director of the Laboratory of Anthropology, the nice people on the Board of Regents said, now, you understand that we're going to go to the Laboratory of Anthropology and take all of the good stuff out of the basement, the rugs and the jewelry and the pottery, and take it down to a museum of Indian art downtown. What are you going to do with what's left, namely an empty building? And I said, well, I'm going to computerize all the archaeological records of the state of New Mexico. And they said, oh, well, that's a good thing to do. Go ahead and do that. They said, basically, you can do anything you want. All we want is an art gallery. And so I started working on that project, and within a year, we had a computer system up and running that archived all the known archaeological records in the state of New Mexico, and that is still the master file for New Mexico. Even after I retired, it continued on. So that was a kind of a continuity with my earlier work with ceramics and lithics using computers. So I computerized all the site records in New Mexico. So that's kind of a quick rundown. Well, in the fall of 1968, I went back to the University of New Mexico, entered a graduate program there. Eventually got a master's degree in 1971. And finished all my PhD requirements in the spring of 1973. Eventually, I was working on my dissertation when I was hired as director of the Laboratory of Anthropology, as well as state archaeologist. It was two kind of jobs. If I was director, I was also state archaeologist. But at that point, I was still working on my dissertation. Now, that job required that I spend a lot of time doing my work. I didn't have time to do the dissertation. And I eventually wrote a nice letter to Larry Strauss and said, sorry about that, Larry, but I'm too busy to finish the dissertation. So I never finished the dissertation. But I was working on it when I was hired as director and state archaeologist. So I don't have a PhD. Hey. Another milestone was way back on the very first day of this contract program at the School of American Research. We went out and found a round rock house, no metal, no glass. Who in the world lived here? In other words, it didn't have anything to do with problem-oriented research and all that stuff. It had to do with like, wow, who lived in this little house? That eventually led to what I was working on as a dissertation in 1979, because it seemed to be that this was where the Navajos used to live, near Georgia O'Keeffe's place in Abiquiu, New Mexico. Navajos? Abiquiu, New Mexico? What's that? Navajos live over there by Navajo Mountain. What's going on? Well, this was a milestone in the sense of this little house must be where the Navajos were living a long time ago. Eventually that resulted in a book called Apaches de Navajo, which I published after I retired. In other words, I was working on that as a dissertation when I was hired, didn't have time to finish it, but eventually wrote it when I was at the last year or two of my employment, and that was then published as Apaches de Navajo after I retired. So that was kind of a milestone that I worked on that. And another milestone was in 1964, working for the Laboratory of Anthropology, I excavated a little site near Hatch, New Mexico. And when I was writing that up, I said, hey, the changes that went on here look like they're coming from Casas Grandes down in Chihuahua, and not from the Four Corners. And everybody else said, oh no, all the changes that were happening here came from the north. And I said, no, the changes are coming from the south. Oh well, anyway, that eventually resulted in a book called The Casas Grandes World, which I published in 1999 with a friend of mine, Cal Riley. We were co-editors of The Casas Grandes World. And we're still saying the same thing as I said in 1964. Hey, these changes are coming from Casas Grandes and not from the Four Corners of the Southwest, which of course put me at odds with all the people whose dearly beloved and everything came out of the Four Corners. The San Juan hypothesis. And I said, no, stuff is coming from Mexico. So those are milestones. Inadvertent finds. In other words, what I'm talking about is doing contract archaeology. You go out and you find things first and try to figure out how they got there afterwards. You don't do this cutesy pie, make up a story, and then find the data, problem-oriented research. No, you find out what's out there and then try to figure out how it got there. Mentors. I think Al Hayes, way back in 1959. Good, decent, straightforward, honest archaeology. That's what I was admiring way back then. Good friend of mine, Dan Wolfman, and I worked at Picaris in 1964, and we were working in the Pueblo, actually digging test pits even underneath people's kitchens. And they would wonder, what in the world? I didn't know all that stuff was under my kitchen. You know, we were doing archaeology for water lines that were coming to be put in the Pueblo. And so Dan Wolfman and I collaborated on that and various other projects over the years. He even helped me do some archaeomagnetic dating in Joyce Well site in the southern part of New Mexico. And so Dan Wolfman was definitely a friend and colleague. And my wife, Polly. I've taken a lot of pictures for Polly over the years. People who are academics have a whole squadron of students that are, following along behind their teachers. As state archaeologist and doing contract archaeology like I did 4 years at School of American Research, you don't develop a whole squadron of students. And so in very real terms, I don't think that I've mentored anybody. That's just somehow, especially when I got to be state archaeologist, that's not what you do. You don't look for a collaboration of a whole bunch of students that are following after you. You don't work like that. You tend to be a loner. It's like being a captain of a ship. It's the loneliness of command. It's a strange kind of world. People say very little about that because people focus on academics. What about the poor guy that has to be state archaeologist? Well, it's like old Harry Truman. He had a thing on his desk that said, "The buck stops here." And that's kind of what it's like to be a state archaeologist. The buck stops here. You're on your own. Being state archaeologist, you run into lots of, quote, setbacks. And how do you manage it? You just be tough. It's really one of these things where a multitude of wonderful things happened. I was removed from my job. I'm not going to go into that. I was then curator of anthropology. And in very real terms, after doing state archaeologist, I was very pleased to not do it anymore. Thank you. Yeah, that's good enough. I was glad to get rid of it. I would like to think that my work with ceramics and lithics were a contribution that I spelled out in 1985 in a long paper called Geology and Archaeology. And that certainly is what I spent the bulk of my archaeological career doing. But I also realized that people don't like that kind of nitpicking, detailed analytic work. So I feel like it was basically ignored. So that's what I would like to think is my main contribution, but it's an interesting thing that has basically gotten lost in the shuffle. However, I've stated it very clearly in publications, so I know what I've done. And on a more interesting level, I've backed away from my extreme empirical position, which is basically what I learned from good old Al Hayes in '59, proper empirical archaeology. More interested in things like the Casas Grandes World book, which came out in 1999, which is more humanistic and painting with a bigger brush. And I think that actually what I was doing with the Casas Grandes World is going to be, quote, my greatest contribution, right? So, what I was driving at in the Casas Grandes World book has to be different from my nitpicking empiricism early on, and is more in the realm of history and humanistic studies, as opposed to demanding empirical evidence for everything you do, which is what I was doing earlier. So if anything, my experience over the years is like, okay, nobody really wants to do that nitpicking empiricism, so let's be more humanistic. People want to do this and people want to do that, and everybody's locked into their own individual stories. There is a need to, back to the empirical position, back up what you think you're believing with empirical evidence one way or another. People are having a hard time doing that. I'm not too sure quite what's going to happen with, quote, contemporary archaeology, because people are so locked into their own individual. I'm a firm believer in the idea of people being locked into paradigms. They don't really change their paradigm, they simply die. And that's kind of what I see a lot of people doing. They don't change, they just die and new people come along. People have a hard time getting off their deeply held stories. There's a real need to back away from the position of all-knowing truth that people in the scientific world think that they're doing, and to spend time coming to grips with the actual modern human beings that are heir to what we were studying. Collaboration. I think one of the most marvelous things that happened at this conference was Polly gave a joint paper with Will Sosi, who's a Navajo from Lucachuca, Arizona, and it was about archaeologists and Navajos. It was real collaboration. And I think that what Polly was talking about in terms of kilomurals is absolutely right on. Don't wall them up and destroy them, which is what some people in the Indian community want to do. Make them part of your modern artistic life. Bring this stuff out so you can understand it and build on your own past. Don't wall it up and destroy it. I think that it's going to take a little while for archaeologists to realize that this is something that has to be done in terms of harmonizing the past with the modern, not only Pueblo people, but Anglo, European white European community. In other words, instead of walling up things like the Pottery Mountain murals and ignoring them, have them be an integral modern part of the artistic community today. That's not part of archaeology, but it's something that archaeologists have to help come into being. So it's a very confusing kind of era. In other words, sometimes archaeologists act like they continue to act like they're the only show in town. And that's not going to happen. The modern people who we're presumably studying are still here, and they need to come to grips with what you archaeologists are up to. Collaboration has to happen, and it's going to force some very real changes in what archaeologists think they're doing. You know, it's a tricky little world, but part of it has to do with the recognition that art is part of the human experience, and you got to make that an integral part of what you're doing. You can't just ignore it and continue doing your radiocarbon dating and all that kind of stuff. You have to come to grips with the human experience